Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You know, your guess is as good as mine if America's former and future president has any real intent of fulfilling his campaign promises once he takes office. But if he does, well, he wants our water.
Millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
Water experts, naturally, dispute Donald Trump's characterization of an extremely complex system as a, quote, very large faucet. But nobody is unclear about his ultimate meaning. Very soon, if not already, California and other parts of the United States will need more water to continue to drive agricultural production. And if they don't have it available, they'll have to go find it somewhere. Which brings us back to Canada, to the Columbia River Treaty, which Canada and the Biden administration are working now to finalize before Trump takes office, to the Great Lakes and their abundance of fresh water shared between the two countries, to Canadian water, in short. And what does that mean for us? And what, if anything, can Canada do about it? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Dr. Jay Famiglietti is a hydrologist and global futures professor at Arizona State University. He is the former executive director emeritus at the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan and the host of the What About Water podcast. Hi, Jay.
Thanks very much for having me.
You're most welcome. I'm going to start by asking you because we are speaking on Monday here, and some news just broke, I guess, around meetings in Lima, Peru, that Canada and the United States are trying to finalize the Columbia River Treaty before Donald Trump takes office. Jay, what's the Columbia River Treaty?
Like many of the transboundary water agreements the United States has with Canada, these treaties are really focused on how the water is managed on both sides, because what happens on one side impacts what happens on the other side of the border. For example, how the waters are managed during a flood, how the waters are managed during droughts. So that becomes very important because we share the watersheds, and it's not just the Columbia River, but other basins across the border. It's become important because Trump recently made some outrageous comment about how there's a great faucet up there in Canada.
Mm-hmm. We're a great big faucet.
Yeah, that's just a great big faucet. And, we could just go and turn it and all that water is going to magically flow into the United States. So I expect that this is a preemptive move by the Biden administration to harden up that treaty before Trump takes office. And I think it's a great idea.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is when he describes it as a great big faucet, how would you describe it?
I would describe the faucet as non-existent. United States and Canada, I think, have great relationships over their shared waters. They share a lot of the same problems: climate change, dealing with a variable water cycle, meaning increasing frequency of flooding and droughts, the need to grow food. So I think the relationship is quite strong. There are no discussions of moving water back and forth. There's no such infrastructure in place. That's just, imaginary. And there's also legal bodies in place. There's the IJC, the International Joint Commission, which manages and oversees the interactions between the two countries. And the Boundary Waters Treaty goes back to, I think, 1909. So we have a long history of cooperation. There's one other thing I want to say, and I think this is really important. People in the United States don't walk around saying, we need to go up to Canada and get that water. It doesn't happen. We have plenty of water here in the United States.
About what you just said, I just saw your piece in the New York Times, and your research team has, I guess, discovered something that's happening in California, or at least discovered more information about it. Can you explain what's going on there?
So our work in California really revolves around the use of some NASA satellites, and it's been going on for a couple of decades now, and we've had the data for a couple of decades. And these satellites are particularly adept at helping us understand how the total amount of water is changing. So all of the snow, the ice, and the water in the rivers and reservoirs and the soil moisture in the groundwater. But also, when we use those satellites with other data, we can get an excellent picture of how groundwater storage is changing across the whole state, and in particular in the Central Valley, which is a huge agricultural region of great importance for all of North America as well as the world. So, long story short, been watching it for 20 years. California's been losing total water availability for the last 20 years. And much of it comes from groundwater, something like 2 million cubic kilometers or 1.5 million acre feet per year is being lost. And it's being lost mainly because of the need for irrigation water. It provides irrigation water for agricultural production. So the challenge or the issue at stake here in the United States is as the groundwater disappears, it's not just in California too, it's in many of the major aquifers in the United States. As that groundwater disappears, not only is the water security at risk, but the food security is as well.
But you just told me a moment ago that America has totally enough water on its own and doesn't need any from Canada. So explain how those two things combine.
So the United States is a big country, like Canada is a big country. And we both share the same distinction in that there are parts of these countries that have a lot of water. And they also share a lack of groundwater management. So in the United States, it is imperative that we take a national level look at our groundwater resources and think about the need for a national level policy or national level oversight. Because many states have groundwater management, but a lot of it is not enforced. A lot of it's not comprehensive. Great example. I live now in Arizona, and Arizona has groundwater management, but it covers only the municipalities, which is not where we use all the groundwater, and it only covers 16% of the area of the state. So the other 84%, which is really where most of the water is used, is unmanaged. So, if we could get that groundwater management under control, we wouldn't have to be worrying about the more, supply side, bringing in more water, hundreds of desalination plants. There's a lot that we could do before we go for that hard infrastructure.
The last time we spoke, we talked about how precious a resource water was becoming, and I asked you if my child would fight in the water wars. Did that just become more likely? I'm not saying, I know we've talked about the laws that govern this kind of stuff, and I want to get into that a little bit more later. But, the water is sitting right there. We have a lot of water. Do we expect that this administration will actually plan for the eventuality, or will they just be needing a fix?
Excellent question. And, when I wrote that opinion piece, this administration was in the back of my mind. Mm-hmm. But I do expect more water wars around the world.
Yeah.
We can come back to Trump, but the water wars around the world have nothing to do with Trump. I mean, we can look around the world and see that so much of it is drying out, or it's melting, or it's losing groundwater to the point now our research has shown that nearly 3/4 of the world's population lives in countries that have been losing water over the last 2 decades, and I expect that to continue. So I see lots of regional tension in the coming decades. Between the United States and Canada, I think there is a very hard political infrastructure that's been built up. It has a long history, and I don't think Canada is going to budge on any of the craziness, nor should it. But that doesn't stop the incoming president from saying these crazy things. And I expect that we'll hear more of that. I also expect that he will try to undo, many of the things that, say, President Biden has done. Mm-hmm. So, for example, President Biden took a great interest towards the last year of his term, took a great interest in groundwater. And asked his president's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to make some recommendations to focus on groundwater. And I had the privilege of testifying before that committee. They go by PCAST. So we hosted a PCAST meeting on groundwater at ASU. And they are making recommendations. What will Trump do? He'll probably ignore them. That's the kind of stuff that he will do.
In your New York Times piece, you made the case, as you mentioned, for preparing and creating groundwater management strategies in order to avoid having to build the hard infrastructure in a hurry. And what you mentioned is, I guess, and I'd like you to describe it to me like an oil pipeline, but for water from the Great Lakes. Explain how that would work, or is that just you spitballing?
No, that's not something that I dream about, or if I dream about it, it's a nightmare. It's meant to be provocative because one of the underlying reasons for writing that opinion piece is that I've tried for many years. I was on a National Academy of Science, which is like the Hall of Fame scientists committee. I'm not in the Hall of Fame, but I was on one of their committees to do a study on exactly this topic. What happens to food production? What happens to food security in the United States if its groundwater is significantly threatened? And we've gotten nowhere with that. We tried for 7 years. I'm off the committee now. And we couldn't generate any interest. I've tried many things. Podcasts, documentary movies, all kinds of writing, as well as my, scientific research papers and lecturing. And it's really difficult to get people's attention. So the idea of the New York Times piece was, let's be a little bit provocative. So do I want to see a pipeline from the Great Lakes to, the Southwest or to California? Hell no. But if that's what it takes to mention, and we didn't invoke President Trump at the time because this was in August before the election.
Right.
But that was clearly in my mind that you could get a person like that who has, dictatorial tendencies. And, who knows? I mean, that's the bottom line. Who knows?
I'm going to ask maybe a slightly dumb question now, just because I'm curious. If building a pipeline like that were to become necessary, what kind of regulations govern whose water is whose when it comes to the Great Lakes, and how would you pull that off?
So, anytime we talk about the Great Lakes, and rightly so, half of the ownership resides with Canada. So, anything that we would talk about would have to be just on, the United States side, and would have to be agreed upon by Canada.
But you can't just take your half of the water in the lake.
Exactly. That's why I don't ever really see that happening. It's really more of, being provocative, but we already move water around a lot in the United States. We move water all around California. We move water around the Colorado River Basin. We've got a huge canal from, the Colorado River across Arizona, bringing water to Phoenix and to Tucson. So we're already doing it. So the point I was trying to make in the article and in thinking about the United States and North America's food security, if we don't pay attention to preserving that groundwater, there may come a time where either agriculture migrates out of California, or, what are we going to do? Are we going to move the agriculture to where the water is, or are we going to move the water to where the agriculture is? And I think we need to study that problem. And, interstate water transfers are difficult. They require treaties, and they're usually within a river basin. So now you're talking about potentially moving water from one, and I'm talking about the United States, not necessarily Canada, moving water from one river basin to another. Well, that's going to require national input. And so that's why I talk about a national water policy. And that's what I'm referring to when I say we have a lot of water in the United States, and we need to grow a lot of food. We have everything we need. We have all the ingredients. And so how is this all going to come together in a future where climate change is becoming more severe? It's, accelerating, in a future where, we're not doing a great job managing our groundwater. So, and the population is growing, and the need to grow food is growing. So what's the plan?
Let's assume and also hope for a moment that you're quite right about the Trump administration not being able to simply come in and get Canada's water, and that, those laws would hold. And obviously nobody's talking about moving troops across the border and that kind of stuff. One thing, though, that I have seen up here is the thought that, well, actually, if the United States needs water, or water is becoming scarce, we have a lot and we could sell it.
Right.
Where are we going when we look at water as a commodity to be bought and sold? And is that something that might happen between Canada and the U.S.?
Sure. I could definitely see that happening, because we around the world have what I call the water haves and the have-nots. And, a big country like Canada does have a lot of water. And if it chooses to sell its water across the boundaries, it probably does already through some bottled water.
Right.
If it chooses to do so and the Canadian population supports it, then fine. So I do see more and more of this because I'm coming from this perspective of looking at these satellite maps, and the areas of the continents that are drying are expanding and expanding, taking over the mid-latitudes. And so that's where I'm coming from, and then sort of projecting out several decades or 100 years. I'm not thinking about right now. I'm thinking really about the future.
Right.
And I think the value of water and the price on water, the value will be much better appreciated. The price will go way up, and there will be thriving markets for water.
The past year, I think, maybe year and a bit, have kind of showed us that we maybe have underestimated how fast the system is tipping in terms of climate. So, how much can we rely on the water that's in certain places now continuing to show up and being able to sort of plan our water management around what we've come to expect, but might be changing rapidly?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. And the answer is we can't really rely on it the way that we used to. So there's this paradigm in statistics called stationarity, that things basically stay the same. And so sure, you've got some extremes, but the mean stays the same and the range of variability stays the same. And what we've discovered in hydrology over the past few decades, there was a famous paper written in our field called Stationarity is Dead, which means that everything is changing and everything is becoming more predictable. Great example, I will use Canada. Climate change models, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reports for the longest time have been suggesting that the wet areas of the world, like Canada, the high latitudes, will get wetter. And the tropics are also, the high latitudes of the tropics will get wetter, and the dry areas in between the mid-latitudes will get drier. And in our data for the first 15 years, we saw that was actually happening. We could see it. Canada's getting wetter, northern Eurasia is getting wetter. You know what? Over the last 5 years, this is not happening. High latitude Canada, high latitude Eurasia are losing water at a rapid clip. And that's because of ice melt, snow melt, permafrost melt, and warming at quite a rapid pace that high latitudes maybe 4 times the global average. So much greater evaporation. And so what we expected in the past, we can't expect it anymore. And so that's why our water managers in both countries, whether they're provincial or state or county or national level, we need to pay very, very close attention to climate change and these dynamics that you mentioned, this non-stationarity, the dynamics of how things are changing and changing rapidly.
What are a couple of things that you'll be looking for or examining in the first 6 months, 1 year of this new administration's water policy or approach to water in general, that you think could tell us a little bit about how worried Canadians should be about the future of our water under a Trump presidency?
I think the degree to which this administration is interested in the demand side will be very telling. And by that, I mean, how much will it invest in efficiency? How much will it encourage conservation? How much will it invest in technology that can help water use be more efficient? How much will it engage with the private sector, who is the biggest user of water? I mean, it's mostly agriculture, but it's the private sector. They're the biggest users of water. And now we've got right behind agriculture, we've got apparel, we've got mining, the data centers and the chip manufacturers who all use a tremendous amount of water. So the degree to which this administration works with the private sector to embrace technology, to embrace conservation, to support efficiency, to support farmers, to help them put in more, low interest loans for more water efficient irrigation. Those are key indicators, right? And so if that administration is not paying attention to the demand side, the only other option is the supply side. So, you asked the question, how worried should Canada be about its water? I think Canada should be really concerned about its water, but those concerns really have nothing to do with the United States. Canada is warming much faster than the rest of the world. Like we said, the snow, the ice, the permafrost are all melting away. It has very little groundwater protection. It's exposed to an increasingly variable water cycle, meaning a greater intensity and frequency of flooding and drought. Forest fires are going off the hook. There's a profound lack of access by Indigenous or First Nations peoples. And Canada has a history of dumping massive amounts of raw sewage into its oceans. So it's important for Canadians and for the Canadian government to take a strong look inward before there's real serious worry about the United States.
Jay, thank you so much for this. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Dr. Jay Famiglietti, host of the What About Water podcast, a water expert in general across North America. That was The Big Story. For more from us, including a previous interview with Dr. Famiglietti, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also reach us with your feedback at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling 416-935-5935 and leaving a voicemail. The Big Story is available in all your favorite podcast players and on your smart speaker. Just ask it to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.